Hi, I'm Dan Bartlett, Curator of Exhibits at the Elmhurst History Museum, and I'd like to welcome you to An Ever-Widening Circle, Elmhurst University at 150. For those of you who are out of the area maybe that would be interested in what we have in the exhibit gallery here that's reflective looking back at the university's long 150-year history, we just wanted to take a few moments and kind of walk through the gallery, emphasize some of the interesting historic tidbits in the school's past, and hopefully give you a sense of what we have. And if you're in the area, maybe an incentive to come and see the exhibit before it closes after the first of the year. The German Evangelical Pro Seminary in Elmhurst opened for classes in January of 1872. The school itself had existed for a few years previous in different locations as a part of the German Evangelical Synod of the Northwest. It moved to Elmhurst from Evansville, Indiana, with the first students arriving by train in December of 1871, ready for classes in that January of 1872. The school was situated on 32 acres, I believe, that was purchased from or donated by Thomas Barber Bryan, a prominent Elmhurst resident, a Chicago businessman, who sold the 20 acres to the school, to the Synod, and then donated an additional 10 acres as well. And that included a grand old house on the most prominent part of the property. And that building is the first college building, which had been operated as Melanchthon Academy prior to the arrival of the students in 1871. So a pro-seminary is like a high school, and the Evangelical Pro-Seminary here in Elmhurst was founded really with two purposes in mind. First, it was designed to be a feeder school to prepare students to attend the Eden Theological Seminary to become pastors in the Evangelical Church. The second reason was that the church needed German language teachers for German parochial schools across the Midwest. So those two were the primary reasons for the founding of the pro-seminary. But the third reason was that in 1871, the idea of going to high school was not yet widespread. And so the pro-seminary is essentially a high school, and there was a track for students that were referred to as college students. That was for those students that wanted a higher education, a secondary education past the elementary grades that would prepare them for other careers in business or other professions. So to get into the pro-seminary, you had to be at least 14 years old, you had to be male, you had to have a letter of reference from your evangelical pastor, and preferably you were a graduate of elementary school, although there was some remedial instruction that was available to students coming in. Tuition was a whopping $150 when the school started, and it would remain $150 for room, board, and tuition through 1913, so it was a great price. And it was a rigorous place. Instruction was nothing like we imagine today. Students spent around 28 hours per week in the classroom, and that's time in the classroom. They took approximately 36 to 39 classes a week. So they're in class or they are studying for class. School starts at 5:30 a.m., 6 a.m. on Sunday. You get to sleep in an extra half an hour. And your time is regimented throughout the day until lights out at 10 o'clock. This includes scheduled times for study, supper, music lessons, evening services, for example, and then also work study, because work study is not a new thing. It was alive and well at the Elmhurst Evangelical Pro Seminary in the 1870s. Among the many tasks that students had to do on campus were farm chores. The campus was 30-some acres large, and a large part of that was a farm that supported the school. So there were milk cows, there were horses, there were corn and oats, and students took part in taking care of all of these crops and animals. And that wouldn't be an unusual situation, as most of the students in Elmhurst were the sons of German pastors or German-speaking farmer immigrants. So this kind of farm chore wouldn't have been an unusual thing for them to do. There was wood to cut, there was snow to shovel, there were rooms that needed to be swept and cleaned. There was water to be pumped. There was just a well on campus, and students had to pump water to take to the kitchen, to take to drinking water for the study rooms, to use in bathing. Everything but laundry and cooking was handled by the students, tending vegetable gardens on campus, for example. One of the most prestigious positions on campus was as one of the designated student bakers. And these 8 students were responsible for cooking, or baking rather, the bread and baked goods that would be served on campus. And it was a prime position if you had a good appetite. So you could lay in some extra carbohydrates in the course of your workday. In the midst of those 28 classes a week, or 28 classroom hours a week, students were learning German, English, religion, history, music, math. If you were headed for the seminary, you were learning Greek and Latin. If you were headed for teaching, you received courses in pedagogy. There were courses in music. All of the instruction was done in German, including the language classes. So you're learning English, but you're learning English in German. And this prevails at the college until the First World War. It's the official language of Elmhurst College is German, and the records are kept in German. German is spoken in the classroom, it's spoken on campus. And it's only around the time of the First World War that it switches to primarily an English focus. At this time, there are more second generation students that are enrolling. So where many students had been coming in the early years from families where German was the first language, now we're receiving more students where English is the first language. And so there's a desire to kind of shift the primary language of instruction of the college from German to English. About the same time, around the time of the First World War, the original high school German gymnasium curriculum also comes under pressure, particularly from alums. As we progress through the 19th century, it becomes more and more common for American students to attend a secondary school. As the high schools blossom, the appeal of the pro-seminary diminishes. And what happens is that students that are alums of the pro-seminary in Elmhurst begin to find that they have trouble getting positions in universities around the country, because the curriculum is this kind of old school classical curriculum and not a contemporary American curriculum. And so those two things combine to create some changes at Elmhurst University around the time of the First World War. The student body has really driven a lot of the development of the school over the years, especially in those first 50 years or so. And there are 2 examples. The first is the library. The school didn't have a library of its own until the reading club was founded by students in the late 1870s. And for a fee or a dues of about 10 cents a month, the group used that money to buy books to create a little book collection that students could check out. And that was kept in a closet in the smokehouse prior to the construction of Old Main, at which time it was moved into the basement of Old Main. Now, the library continued to be maintained by students with donations of books from the Synod and with the permission of the administrators through occasional fundraising appeals through the Synod. The students continued to purchase books and subscribe to periodicals, and that collection began, as I mentioned, housed in the basement of Old Main. That was moved to the basement of Irion Hall around 1912, and it's that point in 1912 when the faculty take over the administration of the library. And with a donation of books from the estate of Thomas Barber Bryan around 1920, the Students' Library, Brian's donation, become the seed from which Memorial Library sprouts in 1922. So again, we think of a library as being an inherent, very important part of an institution of higher education, and it is. But at Elmhurst, that impetus for creation of that came from below, from the students. Elmhurst students are also responsible for creating the college's athletics program. About 1900, they laid out a baseball diamond on campus, and a couple years later got permission to move that baseball diamond to the site of where Langhorst Field now sits. And at the time, that was the college's potato and cabbage patch, so they needed to get some permission to move the potatoes and the cabbages. They had to find someone who could provide essentially a horse-drawn bulldozer to level the field. But they were able to put in a baseball diamond, and very shortly thereafter they started playing other schools in the area. Many of their opponents were the big high schools in Chicago, like Lane Tech, for example. They created a student athletic association. And the Student Athletic Association charged $1 or $2 a year in dues, and the Student Athletic Association then supported college teams. So for example, the early baseball team wore uniforms and used gloves, bats, balls, and other equipment that was provided by the Student Athletic Association. In addition to the annual dues to belong to the association, there was an annual fundraiser held. The association put on a play every year and held that play, opened it up to the public in Elmhurst in the Gloss Hall, and Gloss Hall was the big building that was at the current location of the Fifth Third Bank just across the alley here from the museum. So between those two fundraising things, they were able to get an athletics program going. They were playing baseball, soccer, and competing in track very early. Soccer was quite successful, with the school winning the state tournament in 1912. Now the thing about soccer is it was pushed out of many schools by football, tackle football. The administration at Elmhurst determined that football was much too rough for the young men to play, and so soccer was what they did instead. By the time the college decides to adopt a football program around 1919, the college is actually having trouble finding opponents to play soccer against. So soccer is shelved in 1920, the first year that the football program competes, and soccer will not reappear on campus until I think about 2004. Speaking of athletics, Elmhurst University's mascot has not always been Victor E. Blue Jay. For a number of years in the 1930s up until 1941, the sports teams were known as the Buccaneers. Now this is not a name that was chosen by the students or the school itself. It was a name that was applied to the school by other teams. The university had a reviewer come in 1931 to do an accreditation review, and the reviewer found that the football coach was paid the same salary annually as the president of the college, $4,000. And also that the coach at the time was a little bit less than scrupulous. He was apparently actively recruiting players, which was against the rules. He was failing to keep carbon copies of his correspondence with potential players, probably to avoid keeping a literal paper trail of what he was doing. Students were apparently academically unqualified to be playing. Their grades were not up to where they were be. There were reports of players being paid to play. There was a report of an ex-Chicago Bear that was recruited to come to the college to play football for Elmhurst College. And so in response to the college's bad behavior of pirating players from other schools, the story goes that other schools started calling Elmhurst College the Buccaneers. In 1941, there was a contest that was held in the fall of that year to choose a new mascot name, and the students chose the Blue Jays. And so Elmhurst University switched from being the Buccaneers to the Blue Jays at that time. It takes a while for the university mascot to actually appear, but based on what we found in the school yearbooks, it's about 1964 the 1964 yearbook, when the cheerleaders have a mascot named Miss Blue Jay. And Miss Blue Jay appears in a couple of events with the president, with the cheerleaders, in a very kind of sad-looking papier-mâché head. And apparently this was a good enough idea that Victor E. Blue Jay took over from Miss Blue Jay by 1966. The costume became a little bit more professionally put together, and Victor became an important part of the life of both athletics on campus, but also as a symbol and a mascot of the campus at large. So what we have here are some pictures of the changing, the evolving Victor E. Blue Jay over the years, including this costumed head from the 1980s, as well as pictures of his development and growth up to the present time. So Victor E. Blue Jay used to be Miss Blue Jay. So in response to that kind of recruiting scandal of the early 30s, the college hired Oliver Pete Langhorst to be the football coach, and he eventually becomes the athletic director, and at one time or another in his long career, coaches every sport on campus except tennis. And of course, Langhorst Field is named in his honor. Now, shortly after they hired Pete Langhorst, in 1939, the college hired Maud Johnson Meyer, who was an alum of the college and had recently completed work on a master's degree in physical education. And Meyer was hired to teach physical education, but also be responsible for women's athletics. And at that time, all of the women's athletics, of course, were intramurals. And she was here for about 34 years, retiring sometime around 1973, much beloved by her students with the nickname Teach. Now, it's interesting to think about the opportunities that she had to coach women's athletics versus those that Langhorst had to coach women's athletics. And of course, she was working here in the era before Title IX, which required colleges and universities to take as much interest and responsibility and support for women's athletics as men's. Had she been around in an era when women were competing intercollegiately, perhaps there would be something named on campus for her now too. Homecoming's always been a big deal. From the moment homecomings were first held, usually always revolving around football. One of the traditions has been the bonfire, and to my understanding, there is still annually at homecoming a bonfire on the campus. But I'm here to tell you that the bonfires of today are nothing like the bonfires of the past. It was the responsibility of the freshman class over the course of the first part of their first semester to assemble a monstrous pile of things to burn at homecoming, right on the quad or on the football field. And so accumulating this pile of debris and guarding this pile of debris against vandalism by upperclassmen or people from opposing schools became an important part of being a freshman at Elmhurst. It culminated with lighting this thing on the night of homecoming and creating a conflagration that you cannot hardly imagine in these days of more restrained celebration with fire. The freshman beanie. For maybe about 20 years across the 1950s and the 1960s, freshmen that arrived on campus received a beanie, an official piece of Elmhurst College headgear that they were to wear all times they were in public from freshman orientation through homecoming. And woe be it to any student caught without their beanie, where if they were caught without their beanie, they would be taken before a kangaroo court of upperclassmen who would apply some kind of punishment for the offending students. We have a variety of these beanies here. If you're looking through yearbooks on campus, it's impossible to find freshman class pictures from those 2 decades that don't involve students wearing beanies. I think they should have brought these back. Tuition was only $150 at the school from its founding in 1871 until 1913. This statement from Elmhurst College, dated October 1st, 1954, shows room, board, tuition, health service fees, student activity fees, all totaling $265 a semester. By the 1978-79 school year, inflation and increasing costs of higher education had risen that 1954 cost nearly 10 times to a whopping $2,130 a semester. Elmhurst University students opposed American rearmament in the 1930s. And the yearbook features a picture of a student protest in 1939. Student workers united against the war system. And I think this is interesting because in retrospect it seems very naive that anyone would be protesting doing anything to stop the rise of fascist governments around the world that potentially threaten the United States, because we know how the Second World War plays out and what happens in December of 1949 after December of 1941 after what happened in September of 1939, and how the story plays out. Yet in 1939 there are serious questions about what the role of the United States should be regarding the conflicts in Asia and Europe. And Elmhurst students were actively watching, and watching because they, of course, would be the people on the front lines of any impending conflict. So across the country, there were a number of groups ranging from isolationist nationalists to communists and socialists in the United States across the political spectrum that were against American rearmament and American involvement in wars in Europe and Asia at that time. And Elmhurst students as well were also questioning the wisdom of that rearmament. Among the social justice issues that the university has taken on over the years, in 1943, 4 Japanese American students were invited to come to Elmhurst to study at the university, or the college as it was at the time. This was a controversial move. Many people in Elmhurst didn't feel that it was appropriate for these students to come here, but the school recognized, and the evangelical church recognized at the time, that these were Japanese American citizens. These are American citizens of Japanese descent. They have been placed in concentration camps on the West Coast, taken from the West Coast and placed in concentration camps because there was a fear of their loyalty, which side they would be on as we fought Japan in the Second World War. So the college took a stand against local groups like the American Legion and insisted that these students come to Elmhurst, where they fit in wonderfully with the other students on campus. We can carry that same concern about America's role in foreign conflict forward to the Vietnam War, which of course was hotly debated on campuses across the country, from the large universities, Ohio State, University of Wisconsin-Madison, right down to smaller schools like Elmhurst. And in 1969, students participated in a moratorium to end the Vietnam War teach-in and marched through campus in opposition to the war in Vietnam. That kind of social activism takes a number of forms on campus, especially across the 60s, as the country grapples with civil rights, and there were sympathy marches in favor or in support of those marchers in Selma, Alabama that took place on campus and into the community. There was interest in women's rights, the Equal Rights Amendments of the 1970s, and that continues then onward in campus activism as organizations like Habitat for Humanity attract numbers of students every year that will go on service trips with Habitat for Humanity, building homes for disadvantaged people across the country, creating fundraisers for tsunami relief, for example, after the big tsunami in Indonesia. In 1976, college president Robert Stanger wrote the following as he looked back on both his time as the president of the college, but also the school's long history. I still have the feeling that the salvation of the small college lies in emphasizing its uniqueness rather than making it a part of the general education picture. And of course, the emphasis during all of our time was on the maintenance of the liberal arts character of the college. Times change, and we have to change along with them. This is natural, but I do still have the feeling that a college with a heritage such as Elmhurst has ought to try to somehow maintain its uniqueness. It always had an interest in the development not only of the mind, but also the spirit and the character, the personality. This is very hard to maintain in the modern world, but I think it's something that ought not to be lost, because this is what brought Elmhurst College into being. So thanks for taking this little walk through the gallery with me, and this little walk back through a little bit of the long, interesting history of Elmhurst University. It's been our pleasure here at the Elmhurst History Museum to partner with the university in putting this exhibit together. And we hope that in another 150 years we'll be able to do the 300-year retrospective. Thanks. Hey, these exhibits don't happen on their own. And we'd like to thank a few people who helped us out as exhibit sponsors, and say a special thank you for what they provide to us here at the Elmhurst History Museum. Platinum sponsors for this exhibit include Feezy Roofing, Storino, Ramello & Durkin, and the Community Bank of Elmhurst. Our silver sponsors are Guaranteed Rate, John Nolden, Lakeside Bank, Suburban Bank and Trust, a Wintrust Community Bank, and Christopher B. Burke Engineering Limited. Our bronze sponsor is Michael V. LaCicero, attorney at law, and our friend sponsor is Ken Bartels. We'd also like to thank, as always, the Elmhurst Heritage Foundation. And I would like to thank again all of our friends at Elmhurst University who helped make this exhibit possible. Thank you.